Thank you, Dr. Story, and thank all of you for coming to this session. I'd also like to thank Tierney, who connected us to the network and who's enduring this talk for the second time. So her fidelity is appreciated. Also, Aline Oliver and Brittany Basile, who's helped us all along the way to get here. So following the title of this talk, how turning on and tuning in has created a nation of sexual dropouts, we hope to do two things. One, we want to show the ways in which modern sexuality is deeply intertwined with life in a technological society. And second, following this three-part theme, we want to better understand the ways in which sexuality has been evacuated of its natural and supernatural dignity and purpose in this culture. Why, despite a sex obsession, many in the culture are having less sex and certainly less meaningful sex. And when we're done, you can tell us if we accomplished that, and we're happy to take questions. In a literal sense, we cannot avoid talking about the so-called sexual technologies, things like the contraceptive pill, pornography, and the emerging market for sexual dolls or robots. You can imagine that you will not be hearing a favorable read of these things, but we hope to avoid simply moralizing about them. Rather, our job, as we see it, is to lay out the psychological, sociological, economic, and even aesthetic conditions that have led us here in the first place. In this spirit, we'll interpret the coupling of sexual liberation and technological efficiency and mastery, and we'll bring these notions of liberation and efficiency into conversation by reading the cultural signs and figures that either reflect our current predicament or prefigure what is to come. When I got my PhD, my mother started introducing me as her son, the doctor, but not the kind that helps people. It's fair. I do like to hang on to the notion, though, with my colleague, that like a doctor, we can look at the signs or symptoms of a culture in crisis and provide some form of diagnosis and even course of treatment. So let's begin with another doctor. Does anyone know who this is? Who's that? Close. This is Dr. Timothy Leary, Harvard psychologist who left the teaching and university profession to advocate for the therapeutic use of LSD. And like the other gurus of his generation, he distilled his pseudo-philosophy into a series of catchphrases, perhaps the most famous being the inspiration for our subtitle, turn on, tune in, and drop out. So this was the mantra that he shared with his fellow counterculturalists as they embarked on these so-called acid trips. So this year marks 10 years of love and fidelity and 50 years since Leary first uttered that phrase, again, trying to popularize LSD as a way to heighten and enhance consciousness. Leary's phrase remained attached to the movement through the 60s. It was a shorthand for his psychological program. Turn on meant you were supposed to train or travel inward to activate your neural equipment, your brain in a special way that could open new levels of consciousness and new doors of perception. Tune in meant to externalize those new insights from that inner trip and begin to make changes in your surrounding environment. So your home, your style of dress, your fashion, your taste in art, your behavior, so that you could harmonize or synchronize with this new enlightened perception. And drop out meant distancing oneself from certain commitments, escaping social and political games that were being played by government and the middle-class families with their strict moral codes. It was about creating a world of self-reliance where you drop out of the artificial routines and social performances, things like working and voting and going to school. As Professor George mentioned last night, the 60s counterculture, the me generation, that's given birth to the selfie generation, is a school of thought that rivals the great schools of the past, with its own doctrines, dogmas, slogans, and yes, technological inventions. So we'll return to visit with Dr. Leary in a moment. But first, let's lay out some terms and history. Technology. So the moment we picked up a rock to smash a bone into something sharp or decorative, our ancestors began to manipulate the things of nature in ways that suited some human purpose, making weaponry or jewelry, for instance. Those artifacts, along with language, beliefs, customs, make up the cultural environment in which one's sense of reality is formed and reinforced. To walk through a modern city or to scan the internet is to be a witness to monuments of human ingenuity that exhibit both our collective technical prowess and our most cherished values and beliefs. Culture is always an add-on to nature, sometimes crafted in harmony with it, and other times at odds with it. Plato subscribed to the view that the work of the craftsman when making artifacts is to imitate nature's craftsmanship. We come to love those artifacts precisely because they are extensions of being itself, in many cases extensions of our own human abilities and aspirations. The hammer extends the fist and can be crafted in an aesthetically beautiful, even loving or lovable way. The computer extends the mind, memory, imagination. It can be aesthetically beautiful, can launch a $400 billion company called Apple, and elicit devotion that was once called cultish. There's even an erotic element to our technological pursuits. As Paul Tillich has it, eros is the animating principle behind all of our cultural creativity. It's the driving force that urges the mind toward fresh discoveries and new insights. Tillich uses the expression true knowledge to describe the cognitive union between subject and object, the knower and the thing known. This cognitive union has in it a deeply imitative and mimetic mechanism. In other words, we don't simply think and create out of love of creativity, but we come to love the thing itself. We participate in its created being. It's our progeny. It has something of us in it. So we elevate it for all to see if they also see themselves in it. This is the root of mimetic desire. The desire for an object, be it a technological thing or an idea or a virtue, that is inspired by the desire of others. So we imitate others in our affection for the thing while also imitating the thing itself, allowing it to work us over and reshape our sensibilities in its image. As Father John Culkin used to say, we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. A classical example of this is the role of poetry in ancient Greece. Plato wasn't a fan. Why? Because the poets and actors in the theater were seductive. They tapped into divine madness. They did not possess true knowledge of a subject, nor did they attain to truth itself. That was the realm of the philosopher. The problem was that poems of old often ended up forming the immoral imagination of the audience in a way that was highly involved and participatory. Listening to a Homeric poem was mimetic. One did not simply hear the poem at a remove, employing reason and rationality to understand its meaning and portent. Rather, the listener lost herself in the poem. As the minstrel recounted the adventures of Odysseus, he sank into the performance, and the audience went with him. There was no sense that he was repeating something that had an original. Rather, they were all part of a happening. The audience would enter into the experience with their whole body and all of their senses. They freely abandoned themselves to the spell of the speaker and often repeated or reenacted the sayings and actions of the hero in the poem. They participated with lips, larynx, and limbs, and with the whole apparatus of their unconscious nervous system. They took a trip in a way that we can only begin to get a sense of through our own immersive technologies. We have long since left the orality of ancient Greece. With the advent of electronic media, first radio, then film, television, computers, our capacity for immersion and participation has increased 1,000-fold. Each successive technology, more immersive than the last, has invited a new level of participation, or mimesis, wherein the audience loses him or herself in the experience and then consciously or unconsciously lives out those habits of perception and behavior that have been imparted by the seductive and magical tools of our technological existence. This is a still from a film called Evidence by Godfrey Reggio. The film is 8 minutes of children watching Dumbo, and it's filmed from the perspective of the television. Marshall McLuhan would have it that television is like the inner trip. It's not the sole prerogative of the LSD traveler, it's the universal experience of TV watchers. It, in a way, numbs our imaginative faculty. That, in our mind, which would normally supply the pictures and movement, is not turned on, but turned off, allowing the television image to work us over completely, engaging all the senses, most especially the nervous system. TV is an extension of the trip. Whole body knowing has made a return in the digital age. I have 4 small children, and I especially notice it in my 4-year-old. So when they're watching a cartoon, any sort of program, there is, at the physiological level, a reaction happening, either fight or flight if there's something anxious happening on the screen, but yet there's no physical acting out of that while they're watching the program. So all of these responses are being internalized and numbed and so forth. And when the program is over, it's no surprise to me now that they then go bananas. They start bouncing off the walls because they're sort of working out that physiological response that was numbed during the watching. So what the Homeric poets were to the ancient Greek audiences seeking meaning, the gurus of the counterculture were to the most interesting generation of the last century, to return now to Dr. Leary. If we revisit his famous phrase in light of our brief excursion into mimesis in ancient Greece, we notice some remarkable correspondences. First, turning on. So LSD was a vehicle for exploring the self and changing perception. The purpose of the trip was to seek higher consciousness, to let go of these outmoded social strictures, explore an unfiltered, untainted, and fully alive version of self, a version of self that emerged from beneath the depths of the ego, in the id, desires that needed release and could be brought to light and literally seen while on a trip. Freud does not play an insignificant role here either, because it was his theories of repression and desire and his technique of psychoanalysis that provided the historical context for how LSD would be appropriated by a generation in deep need of some therapy. While I won't be passing out any acid today, I would like to suggest some cultural analogies for understanding what was at work visually in the Freudian psychedelic subconscious. In the early 20th century, we had the Cubists, reacting to a couple of sort of cultural trends. You notice in Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase number 2, it's hard to make out a nude or a staircase. It's a fractured image in two-dimensional space that tries to show multiple angles or dimensions at once. It induces a sort of vertigo as we try to piece together the figure of the woman in the stairs. The image conveys movement, but it also conveys a fractured subject, a person broken into parts, partly a reflection of this tumultuous subconscious, but also a reflection of the industrializing economy that began to see everything, people, products, as things to break down into small parts. It wasn't long before commercial artists, always taking their aesthetic cues from their heroes, the real artists, began to appropriate such imagery into advertising. Terms like segmentation, a term for cutting up into small pieces, now referred to people and markets, a further reflection of the segmentation of parts and processes that made up the manufacturing assembly line. The image is also a reaction to the photography and its newfound claim on capturing realism. The world of images had moved from outward matching in photography to inner making in abstract painting. What does our psyche look like? What do feelings look like? These questions are the long shadows that cast backward by the 60s counterculture and the popularity of the trips into the subconscious to see the stuff we're really made of and incorporate that into our lived reality, what Leary called tuning in after we've turned on. Perhaps most notably, and this leads to our discussion of sexuality, is the link between the denizens of the counterculture and the new titans of Silicon Valley. The most famous was Apple's founder, Steve Jobs, who brought this eclectic blend of romanticism and engineering prowess to found the world's most successful technology company. I can't spend much time on this, but I do commend my book, Appletopia, Media Technology and the Religious Imagination of Steve Jobs. I do make $1 if you buy it. In short, Jobs took the lofty, heightened consciousness-seeking aspirations of the acid heads, along with many of his contemporaries, into the world of technology to form a new band of tech heads who are now reshaping our environment in profound ways. The animating force of this movement is not erotic in the sense that Paul Tillich had it. Rather, it's driven by a toxic blend of 60s counterculturalism and what Jacques Ellul called technique, a relentless pursuit of efficiency. Ellul's critique was not of technology per se, but the pursuit of efficiency and speed for its own sake. It's the underlying ethic that competes with eros and the driving force for all of our creativity and ingenuity. It's a totalizing system from the assembly line to the smartphone, all faster and easier versions of their predecessors. Even LSD itself was a technique for accelerating the laborious process of psychoanalysis. And now the computer, yet another technique for extending and presumably expanding human consciousness in a way that acid never could. Timothy Leary, before his death, even called the personal computer the LSD of the 90s because it enabled the same sort of mental trip with highly developed visuals, an encyclopedic range of knowledge, art, cultural discourse, available in an instant and infinitely reprogrammable. It's the Edenic moment reworked, complete with Apple's half-eaten Apple logo, where we seek yet again and fruitlessly the completion, perfection, and fulfillment that only the incarnation can provide. Rather than appealing to the transcendent source of our being, we retreat into self-aggrandizement and self-enhancement, using technology to pursue our self-interested appetites and desires. In the realm of sexual technologies, it's the contraceptive pill that's become the new LSD of sorts, allowing us to drop out of the pregnancy game and tune in to our own wants and desires. And with that, I'd like to invite Jess.
So let's think about contraception within the cultural matrix that Brett just laid out. Our culture typically talks about hormonal contraception, more commonly called the pill, in terms of women's reproductive rights, morality, and its environmental effects. Our very conversation about the pill is itself fragmented into these different specialized segments of conversation. But viewed within the ensemble of efficiency, we can view the pill as part of our social and technological ecology. You may remember The Matrix. In 1999, amid Y2K anxiety, the first of the Matrix movies debuted. As we all know, the film's protagonist, Neo, faces a pivotal decision early in the film when Morpheus offers him 2 pills. If Neo takes the red pill, he will, quote, stay in Wonderland, and Morpheus will show him how deep the rabbit hole goes. If he chooses to take the blue pill, the story will end. Neo will wake up in his bed as if from a dream and believe whatever he wants to believe. The blue pill offers security in the illusions of the system, the matrix. The red pill offers freedom, an elevated state of consciousness. Taking the red pill is the first step in tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. The choice Neo is confronted with is an alteration of consciousness or a persisting amnesia, the foggy forgetting that he exists in the matrix. But the pill, the contraceptive pill, isn't a mind-altering drug like the red pill in the Matrix or LSD. Or is it? If by mind-altering we mean changing our consciousness, then the answer is yes. The advent of the pill massively shifts the way we view sex, freedom, and community. It is but the technological opening salvo of sorts that progressively erodes sexual integrity and responsibility. And of course, we've already heard that the pill has its antecedents in history, in the movements of the 1890s and the 1920s, in the eugenics movements, in the Lambeth Conference, which laid the groundwork for the acceptance of hormonal contraception in the Protestant churches of England. This inner trip of sorts begins with the human extension of control into the body by controlling cycles of fertility, and facilitates the extension of self by the untethering of sex from generative possibility. Interestingly, I think the extension of control into the body coincides with the exploration, the extension of control into space. We have space exploration around the same time as the advent of the pill. These 2 trips, an inner and outer trip, the projection of the human self into space, the projection of control into the body, can both signify types of death or certain relationships to death. In its most literal form, the pill as contraception is connected to abortion, the literal death of the unborn. But as we've seen with the desire for space exploration, that is now undertaken in a desire to stave off death, to have infinite control over when and how we die. At any rate, biology turned off, sexual autonomy and anatomy and libido are turned on to have free reign. The pill promised a kind of Edenic freedom, a return to untroubled sexual relations between men and women, free sex based solely on pleasure without risk of pregnancy. It allowed us to tune into an altered reality, one disconnected from nature. And for the first time in human history, sex was disassociated from procreation, discipline, community, and commitment. Sociologist Mark Regnerus calls this introduction and mass distribution of the pill as a technological, quote, shock to the social system, end quote. If we listen to the following descriptions of sex, we realize just how deeply the effects of this shock reverberate. Essayist and physician Wendell Berry claims that sex exists within the ecology of human community. In his essay, Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community, he notes, a community is, among other things, a set of arrangements between men and women. These arrangements include marriage, family structure, division of work and authority, and responsibility for the instruction of children and young people. These arrangements exist in part to reduce the volatility and danger of sex, to preserve and clarify its energy, its beauty, and its pleasure, to preserve its power to join not just husband and wife to one another, but parents to children, families to community, and the community to nature, to ensure, so far as possible, that the inheritors of sexuality as they come of age will be worthy of it, end quote. Here, Berry and radical feminist Camille Paglia concur. As an expression of erotic desire, sex is volatile, unpredictable, even dangerous. It must be controlled by social norms and integrated into the social fabric of marriage, child rearing, and communal life, if it is to fruitfully express its full natural possibilities, its energy, and its beauty. Paglia expresses a similar, if not somewhat less poetic sentiment when she writes that sexual liberation is, quote unquote, a modern delusion. That severed from social norms, sexual relations will not lead to Edenic freedom, but to sexual malleability, ambiguity, and violence. All the marks of sadism. In their different ways, both Berry and Paglia affirm the necessity of forming or training erotic desire, confirming the insight of Polish social theorist Zygmunt Bauman, who argued that, quote, desire needs tending and grooming. It involves protracted care, difficult bargaining with no foregone conclusion, some hard choices and a few painful compromises. Most of all, it entails a delay of satisfaction, no doubt the sacrifice most abhorred in our world of speed and acceleration, end quote. A University of Pennsylvania undergraduate quoted in the 2013 New York Times article, Sex on Campus, She Can Play That Game Too, expresses this very abhorrence. She explains, quote, I position myself in college in such a way that I can't have a meaningful romantic relationship because I'm always too busy and the people I'm interested in are always too busy. And everyone says, make time, but there are just so many other things going on in my life that I find so important that I can't make time. I don't want to make time. For this undergraduate who is engaging in a casual relationship with another co-ed who she says she wouldn't even have a cup of coffee with, sex is subjected to a cost-benefit analysis. It is evacuated of its integral meaning and personality. The complexity of desire is reduced to passing whim. Indeed, her reflection on her own sex life is an artifact or exemplification of Bauman's insight. Tuned into the world of speed and acceleration and turned onto it through the pill, she quite expressly states that she does not want to make the sacrifices necessary for a meaningful romantic relationship. Sex for her is about efficiency and technique, the joining of two individuals who are pursuing orgasm. This narrowing of sexual activity to genital pleasure requires the cultivation of specific techniques. And a quick survey of men's magazines, and perhaps more importantly, women's magazines, exemplifies this reality. The primary emphasis, as we can see, is not on relationship building, community ecology, or intimacy, but on orgasmic pleasure alone. If we think about hormonal birth control in terms of both the matrix Brett laid out for us and the matrix, the pill ironically includes both the effects of the red pill and the effects of the blue pill. To be sure, it alters individual and social consciousness about the nature, purpose, and meaning of sex. By controlling the internal rhythms of the body, it promotes what Professor George called expressive individualism. But this altered consciousness is also a form of forgetting. Forgetting the body, forgetting the other, and forgetting the soul. Yet the advent of the pill is not merely a moment, or even the moment, in the modern reshaping of consciousness around the individual self. It is part of a modern narrative structure, a complex structured and characterized by episodic efficiency and fragmented identity. The pill does not, after all, drop out of the sky. Rather, it comes part and parcel with the emphasis on individual self-expression and moral relativism. Yet the pill also accelerates this shift in sex, fundamentally related to procreation and human communion, to an emphasis on individual genital pleasure and the extension or projection of the self. Once the commitment and the risks of pregnancy are off the table, partners are afforded a critical distance from one another. And this distance allows each partner to evaluate and assess the other's technical performance. The significance of one's partner as person is progressively eroded as the focus on sex moves from the connection to all other aspects of a life lived together to a brief, anonymous joining of mechanical parts. In effect, lovemaking migrates from the connection of the eyes to human beings with all that shared life entails to the connection of parts. We move from whole selves to parts, body parts. And so the pill, in a sense, makes sex more self-reliant. No longer dependent on one's mate for commitment or support, relationships are altered from being about mutual self-gift and open to receiving life to mutual but inner trips, pleasure-seeking, hermetically sealed off from life, from possibility, from commitment. The body of the other is still present, but now, in the words of Bauman, it is eminently disposable. These episodes are disconnected and the connection is cheap. But somewhat ironically, in the act of avoiding conception, the pill still gives birth to a new way of being, one which is profoundly isolated. By allowing us to turn off fertility and its attendant sacrifices, the pill allows us to turn on the sexual equipment and surrender or become enslaved to the inner libido. Not surprisingly, the pill gives birth to sex without strings attached, sex which is profoundly inattentive to the body, to nature, and to the other.
So we move from turning on, which the pill allows, to tuning in Leary's conception. This is the moment that we externalize that which we've discovered on this trip into our outer environment, making our media, in this case, and our cultural environment match the inner environment of sterilized reproduction. Just want to say one short remark on economic relations, insofar as economia refers to the household. I don't mean to suggest that sex is merely economic, but there is a sort of economic paradigm in which this is happening, that of late 19th century, early 20th century industrialization and mass marketing. And in this we see the sterilizing the work of production so that consumers no longer have intercourse with the actual producer, the people actually making their goods. So it's part of a much broader contraceptive mentality, the intercourse between producer and consumer that used to exist at a very personal level, where you knew the face and name of the person making your horseshoes or butchering your meat, was severed by industrialization. Products now appear when and where we want them to, even at our doorstep in an instant, and don't require any effort at actual relationship with the producer. Advertising narratives were formed and developed in the era of mass marketing to fill that gap, to provide a story, an identity, a brand, a persona to that faceless and nameless producer and good. Ads filled the void and invited us to enter into them, to fantasize about what it would like to have a Gucci handbag or a Rolex watch. So modern technique is aimed at allowing us to procure, as Jess said, orgasm quickly and easily without the messy effort of building a relationship or caring for another person or persons. This facelessness that accompanies sterilized relationships is captured in Magritte's piece here called Two Lovers, no faces, the attempted intimacy unable to pierce the veil of the other's covering. Ads, in like manner, followed suit, avoiding face-to-face contact, even in erotic situations, going so far as to substitute the product or the brand for the face of the other, the thing that we most want to consume. This fragmentation and facelessness continues, again, looking backwards at surrealist art in 1934, Hans Bellmer's The Doll, and its relation to our way of advertising, our way of marketing to parts, individual parts, severing them from the body, from the whole person. Again, this is not something the advertisers or marketers are necessarily doing as some form of ideology or propaganda. This is merely an effect of the economic conditions in which they're working. One other note, because ads now I think are passé, to analyze print advertising would seem a little 1980s-ish. So we must talk also about social media and the way that it markets to us. The structure of social networks is a mirror of consumerist attitudes, the most contemporary example being Facebook. So I mentioned mimetic desire earlier. It was René Girard at Stanford who developed this theory through reading the world's great literature, seeing that desire for courage or honor or another person was often mediated by someone else's desire. One of his students, Peter Thiel, who went on to found PayPal and also give the seed money to Mark Zuckerberg for Facebook, was fascinated by this mimetic desire and saw in Zuckerberg's nascent social network a social experiment or engine for accelerating mimetic desire, Facebook, the liking things other people like, sharing what they share, inciting behaviors based on that mutual liking. What's interesting, though, is if you know the story of Facebook or watch the movie Social Network, it started with a program called Face Smash, which was Zuckerberg's attempt to rate his classmates based on attractiveness. So putting them on the internet and allowing people to vote on their hotness or not hotness. This sort of consumerizing or rating of people as products, which led, of course, to social networks like Tinder, which allow us to flippantly, not me, but people, to flippantly move through other people as if they were objects to be consumed. So again, this is the visualization now, the externalization, the tuning in of what the turning on has produced, to put into our environment, in our advertisements, in our social networks, this expression or externalization of these various cultural vectors that are pointing to this new sort of situation. akin to the Greek, this sort of mimetic desire now is akin to the Greek actors or the Greek audience kicking the actors off stage and becoming the actors themselves. So if you think about how advertising used to work, it was a model or a spokesperson, someone famous, and now it's your friend on Facebook who's pushing this product or liking this company.
There was a Vanity Fair article that came out not too long ago in which a young woman is quoted, or the author is quoted, as saying that we can now pick our sexual partners in the same way we pick consumer brands. And so this idea that we have become the product that is being sold. Pornography exists within this semiotic culture of depersonalization, fragmentation, and dismemberment. It is the merging of the self with technology and the cultivation of forgetfulness of the self and the body, precisely inasmuch as we overdose on ourselves and fetishize the body. So it's not only a question of eliminating pornography, which we should, it's also a question of the social and virtual ecology that allows the porn industry to thrive as a multi-billion-dollar business. In advertising, the hero shot allows consumers to mimetically envision what it would be like to reap the benefits of the offer. And here we see that the benefits of buying this watch allow you to become a rugged man able to pick up lion cubs. In pornography, the hero shot is sexual climax. The viewer, who is typically male, though this is changing, is invited to identify with the male on screen and to mimetically project the self through both cognitive imagining and masturbation into pornography. Quite literally, the viewer is invited to reap the benefits porn offers, to enjoy sexual climax with the male actor. This merging of identities, the viewer with the hero or the actor, occurs simultaneously with the consumption of a dismembered, fragmented other, typically a woman. Sexual pleasure is not integrated within the context of complementary communion and self-gift, but is rather reduced to sexual equipment alone. A common trope in pornography is the male ejaculation on the face of a woman, a literal projection of the self onto the other, a projectile ecstasy which, as sterile, obscures the face of the other. Though formally, pornographic climax is similar to sexual communion, it is substantively and radically its antithesis. Those who use pornography are immersed into a theater of porn, cognitively through fantasy and physically through the mechanics of masturbation. And like the movement that Brett just described, from advertising to social media, from viewing the product that's on offer to becoming the product that's on offer, porn is migrating from fantasies starring actors projected onto screens to fantasies performed by ourselves. You might remember Tila Tequila in the early 2000s. Or schools, public schools are now having a serious problem with sexting, young people texting each other pornographic images of themselves. So we've crossed over from the mere viewing to the becoming the viewed, distributing ourselves for mass consumption. To enter into porn, one has to forget oneself in a particularly pernicious way, and the other, not forgetting oneself in the kind of mutual self-gift that elevates and sanctifies, but rather in the way that the souls in Dante's Inferno forget themselves and others, despite their proximity, precisely through the enslavement that arises from the incurvature of the soul.
The third part of Leary's dictum, turn on, tune in, and drop out, is drop out. And so we now reach the final stage in which, as Leary had it, we drop out of work or school or social games, and in this case, we drop out of the relationship game altogether. I think one of the defining features of digital media, if we could just pick one, is its discarnate nature, disembodiment, our ability to converse with another without using our bodies, maybe just our thumbs. We see this in conversations. Conversations have been fragmented in much the same way we've illustrated in these other images, to reduce to text messages, hashtag no attention span, hashtag text you later, right? It's bite-sized bits of conversation and not real. So this disincarnation, this disembodiment, the loss of the whole person, brings about what Freud would call a return of the repressed. The body longs to be involved in these activities. The need for the body is so strong that we'll find ways to reintegrate the body, even in a deformed way. So the advent of these sophisticated sex robots or dolls, we are witnessing a return of the repressed. Sex can never be fully bodiless, experienced only on a screen or on a headset or in a sex message. Sex dolls are not actually a symptom of sex addiction. It's that technology can only sideline the body for so long. The body longs to return. And so we see this play out in the trend to recreate a body for sex. But that same body is lifeless. It's a product of the self-reliant, narcissistic infatuation with technologies of self-discovery and pleasure-seeking, a body that does not conceive or receive or produce life.
So let's return to epic narrative once again to see how this movement from anti-conception to pornography ends shockingly in necrophilia. Ovid's Metamorphosis tells the story of Pygmalion, a sculptor, who you see here, who falls in love with the statue he has carved. He bathes it, he feeds it, he cares for it as if it were a woman. And after offering supplication to the goddess Aphrodite, she intervenes and brings the statue to life, enlivening it with the breath of love. The projection or externalization of Pygmalion's idea becomes a living being. And though still on the fringe, dolls and robots are becoming all the more common in our sexual milieu. And this really should not surprise us, as Brett sort of hinted at, though it ought to concern us deeply. The pill decouples sex from marriage, procreation, community, and allows us to turn on our sexual equipment, our inner libido, without restraint or discipline. Porn offers a high-def simulacrum of sexual intercourse, allowing us to tune in to a new sexual reality, one marked by sexual fluidity, variety, and quick, efficient orgasm. All the while, this reforms and reconfigures neural pathways. It repatterns memory to prefer this kind of trip, even as it degrades the integral unity between mind, body, and soul. The trip that porn and the pill take us on is grounded in depersonalization and fragmentation. It's actually a return to the myth of Pygmalion, but this time without the intervention of Aphrodite, that is, without the enlivening and inspiriting of love. A sex doll or a sex bot replaces the other entirely. The body has come back. But it renders this inexhaustible other as a lifeless object. So while the repressed returns, it comes back as a corpse. And we can see this progression through art, advertising, and the heads of sex dolls waiting to be put onto bodies. This fragmentation that progresses from surrealist art through modern print advertising to the bedroom.
So I'd like to see Jess's Pygmalion story and raise it one other myth, and that's the one of Narcissus, to close as the exemplar here. This idea that it's not just that we're in love with ourselves. As Marshall McLuhan had it, most think that Narcissus is in love with his own image, but he's actually just infatuated with this extension of himself in a form other than himself. Echo tried to win, Echo to the left there, tried to win Narcissus's love with her fragments of speech, but it was in vain. He was numb. He had adapted to this extension of himself and become a closed system, a feedback loop. According to the myth, Narcissus's parents were worried because of the extraordinary beauty of the child and asked a prophet what to do regarding their son's future. The prophet told them the boy would grow old only if he didn't get to know himself. When Narcissus was 16, he was walking in the woods, and Nymphs and Echo saw him and fell madly in love with him. Echo started following him, and Narcissus asked, "Who's there?" feeling someone after him. Echo chased him. One of the nymphs prayed that he would feel the pain of unrequited love. And one day he stopped for a drink and saw his reflection. Echo responded, "Who's there?" repeating. And that went on for some time until Echo decided to show herself. She tried to embrace the boy, who stepped away from Echo, telling her to leave him alone. Echo was left heartbroken and spent the rest of her life in glens until nothing but an echo sound remained of her. Nemesis, though, the goddess of revenge, heard the story and decided to punish Narcissus. From this point, Narcissus sees himself in the pond and is amazed at the beauty of this extension of himself and is infatuated with it. But once he figured out that his love could not be addressed, he killed himself. If only Narcissus had lifted his head. Like the prisoners of Plato's cave, he could have pursued the truth in love. It was his inability to respond to love, to exhibit the responsive love at the core of responsibility that led to his demise. Narcissus does not need to turn on, tune in, and drop out. If we think of the current technological environment, we need to turn off, tune out, and lift up. Thank you.